This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Christina Bell, and I am the Program Manager with Atlantic Institute in Greenville, South Carolina. I'd like to welcome you all today to our second Tour of Faith. What I did this year is I lined up a couple of really neat places for us to see virtually that were not in South Carolina. And I'm excited to show the first one is St. Paul's Church National Historic Site in Mount Vernon, New York. I Googled and I looked up different sites in New York, in Massachusetts, in DC, in Charleston, and emailed and got responses from a bunch of places that were willing to participate in a tour of faith with us. And so we have with us today David Osborne, and he is going to, he's the site director for St. Paul's Church National Historic Site. And so he's going to give us a tour and tell us a little bit about St. Paul's Church in Mount Vernon, New York. If you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and then I will go ahead and ask him those questions when the time comes up. If we continue to stay a smaller group of us, just us, then when we reach a different point in time, we can go ahead and open it up to if you would like to ask a question personally, you can. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to David Osborne so he can introduce himself and he can go ahead and start our conversation for us.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the introduction, Christina. Good morning, everybody. I'm David Osborne. I'm the site manager here at St. Paul's Church National Historic Site, which is a unit of the National Park Service. So Mount Vernon, if anyone's ever been to New York City, it's just over the border from New York City. We're very close, but not quite. So we are a suburban community just outside of New York City, probably about 10, 15 miles from, downtown Manhattan. Let me share a screen here.
I was gonna say, you are, your picture is not showing up on the David Osborne page. And I know that you had logged in also from St. Paul's Church.
What happened? I lost my let me get my picture back and then I'll try to share a screen again. Yeah, I'm having trouble. Okay, so there I am. Let me now share a screen. I'm having trouble sharing the screen. I want to share my entire screen. It's not letting me. Do you have to enable other people to share screen, Christina?
No, because
like sometimes as host is a way that.
Here. Now you are entirely the host. We should have done that beforehand. I'm sorry.
Okay, I think I got it. Okay, am I sharing?
Yep. It says you have started sharing screen sharing.
Get my program up here.
Oh yeah, there I am.
Okay. Okay. Can everybody see the nice big picture of the church and the cemetery?
Hold on one
second. Can you see that?
For some reason, we should have. Usually I do this and we do a run through and it works just fine. Nope, I can't. I can see the web page. You might have a different page. I see you have your mail page and then the web page or the Zoom page.
Okay, so you're not. Yes. A nice picture of the church, huh?
Are you on two screens?
Yeah, I mean, let's see. Okay, so let me back out. It says that I'm sharing. You sure so you can't see the picture of the church, huh?
No, I just see the Zoom page, but are you on two screens? Because it might be you have to share the second screen if you have two screens going.
Okay, stop sharing and go back. Let's see. I'll try again. All right, share screen. Not letting me do it. Let's see.
Hmm. Yep, now I can see your taskbar with all your tasks. And it's pulling up the PowerPoint. There you go. Yep, there you go. And now you're muted though. You need to unmute. All right, David, as long as we can, well, we were able to see that, but you need to unmute yourself. All right, thumbs up if you guys can hear me. I just want to say, okay, good, Maureen. I got it.
Can you
All right, there we
hear
go.
me?
Yep, now I can hear you.
Okay, everybody, so this is a picture of St. Paul's Church fairly recently. It's one of the oldest buildings in America. A lot of it is actually older than America. They started to build it in 1763. And if you look from the bottom, hopefully you can see my mouse, you see you go up about 2/3 of the way with all these light rocks. All of that is in place by 1763. So the bottom is actually built by colonists. They're not even Americans yet. And then they had a long pause and they finished this church after the Revolutionary War. But this is a pretty recent picture of the church, and it is surrounded by a historic cemetery. There was an earlier church there. This is the town's first church, built about 1700. It's an old community, it goes back to the 1660s. So 10 families founded this parish, this town, 1665. In the very beginning, you know, as religious people basically out in the wilderness, they would have just had religious service, whoever had the biggest house. Like when you come to a Sunday and they wanted to have what they called meeting, they would have just had religious service and whoever had the biggest house. By 1700, there's enough people in the community and they have enough resources that they build their first meeting house, they would have called it. They would have been a little reluctant about using the word church. Doesn't make any sense today, but they were very low church Protestant. They're definitely Christian, but they had a feeling at the time they're not that far away from the Protestant Reformation. Anything that might have inclined towards the Catholic Church was still very uncomfortable and unsavory to them. So they wouldn't even use the word church. It was a meeting house. You know, people of faith would meet every week in a modest building with minimum, ostentatious display. And the emphasis was on the Bible, not on the ritual. Long Bible readings and sermons by the minister, and then they would sing their psalms. So this was their first meeting house, a small town. They're not very wealthy. This is all they could afford. In early America, everybody built with wood. It's always around. They only had about maybe 80 to 100 people in the village when they built their first meeting house. And that lasted about 60 years. They started to build the new one, the one we have today, in 1763. By then, it's an expanding community. Maybe they're up to about 250 people. The first one was always seen as temporary anyway. It used to flood out. And by the way, it's not there anymore, but the place where it is, about 60 yards from the current St. Paul's, anytime we have bad rain here, it still floods down there. So they're a little wealthier. They need a bigger, church for the town. So they start to build this new church in 1763. This is just a drawing, of course, but it would have looked like this, a crude sense of scaffolding, the hauling animals, the oxen are bringing in the rock from wherever they're bringing them, simple pulleys. They're starting to build it in 1763. And then the Revolutionary War gets in the way. They stopped for a long time. The Revolutionary War hit our area really hard. This was a battleground, not just one battle, like for 7 years or so, the British Redcoats and the Americans are fighting over this ground. Couple small battles, couple of big ones, but it's like in play between the armies for 7 years. Almost everybody in the community, the parish, left. If the war hits the area for 7 years, family life and religious life are just not possible. Everybody evacuated and they go various places. Some, maybe you got relatives over in Connecticut or New Jersey, you get out of there. So during the war years, it's a hospital. Nobody's here anyway. It's a big building, even though it's incomplete. It's right in the middle of a community. And I think, churches are often used as hospitals. They're always the biggest building in the town. Maybe there's a spiritual reason. I think with this one, it's just practical. It's a big building. Nobody's here. Nobody locked the door in their day. And armies would take it over after a local battle to treat their sick and wounded. Sometimes the Redcoat British, sometimes the Americans, because the area is always in play. Many men died in there during the war when it was a hospital. This is our display on the lower right, everybody, of what the church would have looked like during the Revolutionary War. You just had some straw and blanket on the ground. It's not a hospital, it's a church. So when armies take it over to use it as a church, they have to get a temporary bedding. These are the crude kind of tools you would have had in a Revolutionary War hospital. It's an earlier time. There's no electricity. There's no, computers or anything. Everything's handheld. You got the little ball remover here. Right next to it is a probe in case they don't know where the ball is, because it's the 18th century. They have no x-rays, just a lot of, alcohol to kind of douse the nerves of the soldier. That's probably what it would have looked like. We use that as kind of like an educational program when the students come. So after the war, they do complete it. This is our earliest actual photograph of the church. It's not till 1860, because the camera's not really even invented till the 1840s. But this is about 1860. They have completed it. It has a separate tower for the bell, and this is the original steeple, kind of hidden by the tree. But in their days, the steeple's very open. You want everybody to hear the bell. It's the only source of communication. They certainly ring it on Sunday to alert people to church service, but also, at the church bell at the time, before we had the telephone or anything, it had a certain number of rings for a fire, a certain number of rings if somebody died, and most of the community lived right near the church. So it had a whole series of functions. And in those days, you still had the weather vane at the top of a church, because most people are a farmer. It's like the community weather forecast. It's like you want to know which way the wind is blowing in an agricultural world. The church is obviously the highest point in the community. So farmers were accustomed to looking up at the St. Paul's steeple. And if it's blowing around really fast or in a certain direction, they would probably make a decision, not to plant their seed that day. So the steeple had quite a purpose and a function in their day. This is what we see today, but this is what the inside of the church looked like originally when they finished it in the 18th century. And in their day, remember, a church in a little town, today, usually we understand a church to be, a private house of worship built by one congregation. Not that they don't let other people in, but it is, built by one denomination pretty much for their purposes. In their day, this was a public building. In early America, in these little towns, there's only 300 people. It was the church. Everybody was assumed to be a member of the parish. That doesn't mean they all worship there, but they might. It's just too small a community to support more than one active church. So the town is responsible. It was a public building. Church service on Sunday, certainly, but this is where the town government met. This is where you had a public meeting, maybe a political meeting. It would serve as the courthouse. It looks more like a courthouse than a church. Everybody says it was. 3 times a year, you had a rotating court in their day. So it served many purposes. And the reason they built it like this, it doesn't make any sense today. And it didn't really have too much to do with religion, to tell you the truth. They're living at a time, they had no heat in the building. The winters were long and cold. And they didn't, all this white plaster on the walls, they couldn't afford that yet. In their day, you see the stone wall on the inside as well as the outside. So they have no insulation. They don't even have a ceiling until the 1820s. So it's really cold. I mean, that's really the issue. Cold, long winters, no source of heat. They couldn't afford a central stovepipe here. That was why they would build it like this. They would divide the pews based every year on your family donation. Might seem unfair. It's supposed to be everybody's equal, in the church, but they needed revenue. So, the more you gave, yes, your box up here are probably the wealthier families giving more money. The big ones would be the big families. It's like an annual donation you make in return for your pew. The big ones are not the wealthiest families, they're the biggest families. They're still living at a time of, almost everyone's a family farmer. You do have 10, 11, 12 children sometimes. So the biggest families got the biggest pews. Other than that, it's usually based on how much money your family gave. And there's little plaques on the church pews put back years later to show what the names of the families were who sat in those pews. But at a time of no heat and no expectation of heat, this is how deep they were, like 4 feet deep. So typically you'd open the door and you'd file in. You are crunching together on a winter day. These are not strangers. This is your family. Maybe 4 children and 2 parents in a typical pew. You do get down low. That's the whole point. So on a cold day with the 4-foot-high wall, maybe a blanket is wrapped around the family. You are already a little warmer because you're blocking out some of the cold, drafty air with those tall wall box pews, right? And then they would line the floor with something that slowly and surely let off the heat. That's really why they built it like this. Everybody would have maybe 4 per family. A simple box made out of tin and wood. This is from their time period. And in their day, you had a handle so you could carry it. These holes are not random. They're carefully poked in by a tinsmith so that something in this box could slowly but surely give off the heat. And the source of heat was at home. They're living at a time when everybody had a fireplace. A safe bet. If you lived in New York in the 1700s, everybody had a fireplace. It's the only way to cook and heat your home. So this is a recreated colonial fireplace, but everybody had something like this at home. By the way, they're hanging the kettle down here. They call it a kettle, Kettle. And in their day, the only way to turn the heat up, by the way, is to get a longer hook, and it would come down lower, and a shorter hook, you raise it up higher. But for our purposes, a wood-burning fireplace, of course, lets off the chips and the embers and the ash down here. And they would just get a cup. Everybody would have, a cup or 2 or 3 or 4. Fill up the little cup with the burning embers. And then in those days, this thing would open, and you put the cup back in there, and you had a handle, and you would carry it into the church. And imagine everybody's got 4 of these on the ground, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. The heat comes up slowly but surely. It eventually runs out. Maybe the last half hour of service, you've run out, but you've built up enough heat. And then everybody gets a little warm spot. And on a day of the full church, you'd have well over 100. You got 30 pews. Everybody's got 4. That's really why they built it like that in those days. It has not too much to do with religion. It was just a practical issue in the 1700s. How do you use these big common buildings for church service or community events at a time of cold, long winters and no heat? That was really what they were doing. And with this setup, in their day, the term would have been low church. They're low church Protestants. It is a very simple setup here. It was still about the word and the sermon and the Bible. The reading desk here, the minister would read from scripture, whatever the minister chose, his choice for the day, long passages from the Bible, and then come up here for the sermon, which is, a talk about the religious side and sometimes other things they would talk about based on that passage that he read from scripture that day. So that was basically the highlight of the service. The sermon could be an hour. Service was maybe 2 hours typically. There's a long Bible reading, and then he comes up here for a long, sermon based on that week's Bible reading. And no amplification. One quality of a minister in their day was good, strong vocal cords. You want to be heard everywhere. So they face this way. So everybody, can see the minister, and you'd be surprised, even with these boxes. People do this today, even youngsters who visit us. When the minister is up here, a grown man is up here, 5'8", 5'9", 5'10", you can actually see. Everybody thinks you can't see, but this is the highlight of the service. The minister's up there for a long religious sermon on the Sunday morning. You actually can see. In this box sat what they call the clerk. We today would usually say a deacon, probably. It's the clerk. It's an administrative title, the minister's helper. Lived right across the street from the church, got there first, opened up, was like the minister's helper, probably had the best voice in town. They don't have a choir till much later. So the clerk had to have a good voice and had to know the words of the religious songs, the psalms and the hymns. In the beginning, they don't have hymn books. They're just getting back on their feet after the devastation of the Revolutionary War. Many people would know the words of the psalms and the hymns, but the clerk had to have a good voice and line out, one line at a time. That would be his job. And then you see this feather here. This was the tickler. That's really what they called it. During the sermon, the clerk would open the door and patrol around. I don't know how often it happened. This is a better picture. But with the tip of the feather, the tickler that's what they called it, in case somebody nodded off. I don't know how often. We don't have any records. Maybe some Sundays it's not as uplifting. Maybe other Sundays it is, and everybody's listening. But if anybody fell asleep, the tradition was with the edge of the feather. It's a long stick, it's like 4 feet long, with the feather on the end. This would be turkey and in their day, there's all these wild birds in this area. No problem. If you lost a feather, you could get another one and reach into the box and tickle you under the nose. That was the tickler. But that was how they worshiped initially. And for a long time, it was really based on the reading from scriptures and the sermon. They rarely took the sacraments. It doesn't make any sense today. This was an Episcopal church, but in their day, they still had that kind of aversion to the sacraments and the Lord's Supper, fearing that it was a leftover from the Catholic Church. It was false and idolatrous, and it was superstitious. What they believed in was the Bible. The Bible, reading from the Bible, commenting on the Bible, all those other things they thought were vestiges which they felt uncomfortable with. Maybe 3 or 4 times a year, when the minister finished his sermon, he would walk over to the other side of the church over here and offer the Lord's Supper. Many of them still wouldn't take it. They still thought it was false, and they would walk out of the church. Some did take it. But that was how they worshiped initially, and then for a long time. There is a bell at the top of the church. Remember, we were talking about the steeple. This is a little sidebar, but this bell is the same age as the Liberty Bell, the famous Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. It never cracked. It's about, if anybody had been to Philadelphia and seen the Liberty Bell, this thing is like 1/5 the size. I think that's why it never cracked. It's a much smaller bell, very well made, bronze, but it's made in the same foundry in London as the Liberty Bell. And it has had and still has a reputation as being like the junior version of the Liberty Bell. It's still on the same wheel. It's still up there. We rang it 13 times on July 4th to salute the original 13 states. It does work, and we ring it occasionally. It is the same bell that somebody heard back in colonial times. And during the Revolutionary War, they took it down because they were afraid that an army would get a hold of it, unfortunately, and probably melt it down and use it to make a cannon or something. But it is still up there. This is the church in the mid-1800s. And by then, they're coming a little closer to what people would usually assume a Protestant church was. They had one minister for 57 years. His name was Father Coffey. Got here in 1852. He spent his whole calling, his whole life here through 1909. He's buried in the churchyard. He brought in what they were usually calling the high church orientation, where he was kind of confronting, when he first got there, the older tradition where they saw the usual vestiges of Christianity. Those people would have said that's really for the Catholics. Doesn't belong in a Protestant church. he brought in a different orientation. He was hired as a young man, and the longer he was there, he brought in closer to what we would usually think that would be in a church. So this is Christmas time in the 1850s. That they had just put in this painting, Paul before Felix. You know, St. Paul, the apostle from the New Testament, is being forced to testify in this painting to Felix because he's being confronted on his religious views. And they had just put the painting in, and we're pretty sure somebody took this picture to welcome the painting, and it's probably Christmas time before the Civil War, so it's the 1850s. The church is decorated. By then, they do have tablets up. These 4 tablets date 1848. It's the 10 Commandments and the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed. The minister by then probably is giving the Lord's Supper on most Sundays. You see the more, elements we would be comfortable with in a Christian church, the cross and the decorations, much more of like a spiritual inside. What most people think probably happened is that this is what they inherited from their ancestors, that this is what a church is supposed to look like. As time went on, and there's no one day that this happens. This is a slow but gradual process. By the 1840s and 50s, and then with Father Coffey, there's just the sense eventually that it's a church. It's not a it's a special place. It's a holy building, and it needs some kind of display that reflect your spirituality and religion. It's not a meeting house. It's a special place. So they became less, adverse. And also, by the way, they got a little wealthier, because when you start to do this, you're getting a little wealthier. So not on any one day. And also, if you look at the church in the 1850s, you don't see those high boxes anymore, right? This is a little more traditional church benches facing the way we would think they face. By then, they have figured out a way to heat the church. They get a wood burning fireplace and then eventually coal. So they no longer need those benches, those big those big wall boxes. They could go with the more traditional church bench. And by then you can see they do have hymn books. So they don't necessarily need somebody to line out all the words. So this is how they then worship for many years, much closer to a traditional sense of what a church is going to be. And they are using the word church by then. They've lost that uncomfortability with it. It's time, it's change, and then it's also one particular person. If you get a minister for 57 years who eventually becomes the beloved, trusted Father Coffey, and if he wants to alter the church, he eventually is the person who brings them over into what's usually called the high church tradition. And by the time he dies in 1909, they have established, but for years by then, people have just grown up with this is what the church should be like. This is the last year before the rest is. This is 1940. Kind of close to modern times. You do see, decorative stained glass in the windows. There's a baptismal font. The altar has been modernized. They still have the tablets there. You can't read them, but 10 Commandments and the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed. Aisles, as we would think. This is 1939. So when President Franklin Roosevelt visited the church in the 1930s for a special occasion, it was an Episcopal church. He was Episcopalian. He would have seen the church like this. What happened was, why do they go back to this other thing that we see today? The church was having trouble holding enough parish. The area was starting to change enough that the residential character, because when this place was founded, back in the 1700s, the church was the center of your whole town. It was the church, but it was also your political center. It's where your town government met. Everybody lived pretty close to the church. And as the town grew, they just took up the next rung out on a circle. By the 1930s, if you ever visit us here, you'll see this area was starting to change. The residential character was fading. It was becoming much more industrial and commercial. You had warehouses and factories. and by now machine shops. So the parish was shrinking. It was falling in size, not because of anything in the church. I think, the spirituality and the minister, but it was really external. Fewer and fewer people lived around here. And this was an Episcopal church. So if you ever come to our area, this is a pretty common denomination around here. So even if somebody moved to a nicer community 8-10 miles away, they would find another Episcopal church. They didn't, to stay within their communion and their faith, they didn't really have to come back here. So the parish was very historic, but in terms of size, it was shrinking. And the decision was made at the time by the minister, Father Weigel, with support from the president, Franklin Roosevelt, and his mother, Sarah, that if they went back to this older look of the church, wouldn't it now get a new lease on life? That it would look that no other church looks like this. How many churches look like this? And they thought people would come back and want to pray and worship and donate money here because it was so unusual. And it would now be a historic shrine to early America, as well as being a functioning Protestant church. So they made the decision to go back to this from this. And I must say, the little research I've done, I just work here, right? But as a National Historic Site, it was controversial. There were some families who wanted it to stay like this. They thought, well, we live in 1938 and 9. We don't live in 1787. We have the spirituality and expectations in our house of worship because today we don't live in colonial times. We don't want our church to be a historic museum. We want it to be our place of faith and prayer every Sunday. And there were families who said, but if you go back to that, I don't live then. I don't think like somebody in 1787. I'm a religious person in 1938. What are you doing? It was controversial. And from what I could tell, some families left the parish when they went back to that. They said, okay, I'm going to another church that still reflects my spiritual meanings. By then, of course, we got the automobile, because when they first built the church, everybody came here on a horse-drawn carriage or walked here and you had no other choices. By the 1930s, you probably have other choices. But they left behind this in the 1930s and they went back to this. So when you visit us today, this is what you see. The restoration, a very good one, but a restoration of what the church looked like in 1787. And this would be a service probably in the late 1940s or 50s. People are now back in these pews. This is Father Weigel over here. He was their minister. He's the one who engineered the restoration. They're decorating here. Probably is Christmas time. They're facing this way to the front, but then when he gives the sacraments, he then walks over to the other side. And it functioned this way through about 1980, where they had the historic restoration, but they were still a modern Episcopal church. By then, they do take, Episcopalians would say the Eucharist, they take it every Sunday, and he would walk over here, and then there's a communion railing, and there's his altar, and he gives the sacraments here. It was somewhat awkward. I worked here a long time. I met people who said, yeah, they tried to keep history and modern religion together, and it was pretty awkward. But this would be the late 1940s. This is one of the last years as an active church. This would be the 1970s. I think his name was Father Lott. I understand he was very well respected. He's over in the side of the church. This would be a prayer service, at some time during the week. It's still decorated. Here's the altar. By then, those tablets have been moved back here. The Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed and the Ten Commandments. This is the last generation of the church. So their last service as a working church was November 1st, 1980. The parish was declining, and they got to the point where the bishops of the church felt that with only about 3 or 4 families coming on a regular basis and the cost of running the parish, but it had a lot of history, it had enough history that when it seemed to be running out of steam as an active house of worship, they approached, the National Park Service and said, are you interested? It has connections to the American Revolution. There are things that happened here in the 1730s that influenced the Bill of Rights. Are you interested? So they had an agreement that there would be one last service, November 1st, 1980, and then the property was gifted over. So in that strict sense, it is no longer an active church. People come here to learn about the past, to see how churches functioned at one time. But in that regard, it is actually no longer a working church. It hasn't been since 1980. This is the church today as a National Historic Site, picture taken pretty recently. People come and learn about the history and the American Revolution and what churches were like in colonial times, because it does have the look and the appearance of that era. Why did you have the pews? Why did the family sit like that? Why were the pew walls so high? And then one stained glass has been retained to represent the others. And here's those tablets now back there, but they are the original tablets from 1848. Here was the sermon mount. Here was the reading desk, and other things have been added over the years. Because now people come, thousands and thousands of people come before COVID, like all places. We're just barely, getting back on our feet. School groups come, tourists, people kind of like what you are. There are church groups that come here who are touring other houses of worship, even though, this is no longer a working church. In terms of the building and the parish, it is one of the oldest churches, in America, really in New York, especially on the outside. So if you visit us today, this is what you see. And we explain and talk about and, consider what was the church of its day. And then part of the story is, why is it no longer a functioning church? That's definitely part of it. This is the outside. The cemetery, by the way, is one of the oldest burial yards in the whole country. It is a churchyard. They start to bury here once they build that first church. It's 5 acres. There's 8,000 people at eternal rest here. Burials still continue. There was one last year. And here's the oldest stone out there. And you buried people in early colonial times, 1704, with these communities and these parishes that are so small, like 100, 150. All they would put on the stone was someone's initials. Because it's a very small community. They all knew each other well. They all lived right around the church. The whole community is centered around the church. A lot of them are related. They came over from England, in family groups. So they all knew each other. And the carvers are not good. So I don't know if you have these in South Carolina, did they go that far back? But in these early cemeteries up in New York and New England, you just see somebody's initials. That was enough. That was all they needed. This picture was taken in the 1930s of the oldest gravestone. And on that day, somebody put some chalk on it. But it is the original inscription. Pretty crude. Nobody had gravestone carvers. Probably someone in your family goes and gets a rock from the field, hacks it in there with a hammer and a chisel. Somebody died 1704, Feb 14. And the first name was Matthew, with just the initials. And ironically, he died on Valentine's Day. That is his last name. Matthew Valentine died on Valentine's Day, 1704. So if you've ever come visit us, people tour the cemetery to see the interesting carving styles, religion, and, people's hopes for the afterlife. That's what's reflected in the cemetery. But sometimes they just look, where's the oldest stone? Wow, how crude it was in an earlier time. There was this person died, they're not even an American, of course, they're still a British colonist. All right, so that was kind of what I had to say there.
Very
I'm not
neat.
sure if you had any questions in the chat or anything, or you want me to leave the picture up, or
If you could do me a favor and click on the 3 dots on my picture and just make me a co-host, that would help, just so I can make sure I have everything correct.
so
We
you're
have
not
one.
a co-host anymore?
No, when you had screen issues, I threw all host over to you. But I did get
Okay,
one
I stopped
question.
sharing.
One question that
Oh.
Dorcas asked was, what Bible, do you know what Bible they used back then, like in the beginning? She had asked that in the beginning. So like in the 1700s?
Well, let's see. Initially, they're using the Geneva Bible, not the King James Version. The Geneva Bible was what the Puritans usually used. And these people, when they first come down and set up their town, they are Puritans. They kind of rejected the Church of England, and they had the Geneva Bible, which had many comments in the margins reflecting people back and forth. So later, people get familiar with the King James Version. They're using what's usually called the Geneva Bible, a translated version into English. It's put together in the 1580s, I think.
Wow.
That's the Bible. And it was certainly the one book everybody had. Everybody in their community, would have had the Bible. So that is their common religious world. That is their common understanding. Later on, after the revolution, they turned to a different version. But when they first settled the town, they were using the Geneva Bible.
I remember when I emailed with you before, I told you like the way the pews were all set up were very interesting. And so you said you were going to discuss that. That is so very interesting. It's even interesting that they went back to that style. You would think a church that the parishes were dying off in there, or not, it was not as popular, wouldn't like invest in changing the structure layout of it anymore. So it's very interesting. It's very neat. I'm trying to imagine myself in the early 1800s.
Yeah, they thought that they could go back to the world of colonial times with the pews, but still be a modern church. So I think they went back to that. They didn't go back to that for religious reasons.
Right.
They didn't really, these people lived in the 1930s. They had the expectations of what church would be like in the 19th, but they thought, have you ever been to Colonial Williamsburg, anybody? I don't know if you have been, but the church there, that was their inspiration. It's the Bruton Parish Church. It's an Episcopal church. They had just done the same thing, and they thought that they could, take that style, and now it would be so unusual that people of faith would say, even though it's unusual, I want to come back here and worship here, even if I'm not Episcopalian, because it's so unusual. That was why they did it, to try to reverse the decline of the church.
What I thought of, oddly enough, now with what we've been through, is that is a perfect setup for social distancing. I was like, every family is in their own section and nobody's touching anybody else. And I was like, this is so sad that my first thought now
is high pew walls. Yeah. They were ahead of their time. Right.
Yeah.
And there are still people who come back, like I've been here, who come back and visit, and they recall, remember 1980. So it's not like it was 100 years ago. There are people in the community who were among the last generation of worshipers here. And what they usually say is it was kind of sad, but like there was another Episcopal church 6 blocks away. So when the diocese said, in order to save this place, we have to give it over to a responsible historic agency. The National Park Service is not going to knock it down or anything. They respect it, right? Even though it's not a working church. And you were down to like 3 or 4 families. They said people were a little sad, but only 6 blocks away, there was an Episcopal church. So they could just stay in their communion, as an Episcopalian would say, and not go that far away. So they were sad. And I think like they tried in the last 15 years or so, various ways to try to keep it going. And, I'm sure these things happen with historic churches and changing communities. In some ways, because it had enough history, it got a new person to possess it who there's no worship here anymore, but it's certainly respected and maintained and preserved. So It's a tricky question,
Right. We have
I wasn't here when all that happened.
right.
Yeah.
So I do see there was a Dorcas. Go ahead and ask your question because I know you have your hand raised.
Okay, yeah, thank you. This has been really wonderful. One thing I'd like to know, I don't know if I missed it, what country were the people from, the early settlers, and what were some of the common last names?
Yeah, let's see. They're coming over from England. These are English colonies in the 1600s. So they're English Puritan colonists coming over here. Let's see some of the names. All right, so for South Carolina, there was Pinckneys here. There were a lot of Pinckneys here. And I think they're related to your South Carolina Pinckneys if you go back to England. Apparently,
Right.
at one
Yes.
time, some of the Pinckneys went to South Carolina, some came to New York, and then they lost touch with each other. Nowadays, we all stay in touch with each other, but in their day, you'd lose touch. There were Wards, common name. Valentine, that guy with the oldest stone, that was a pretty common name around here. Let's see. Pinckney, Ward, Fowler was common. Kind of English names. These people are English. That's who they are. They're English immigrants living in colonial America.
Very interesting. Alexis was asking. Sorry, I was Alexis was asking if the church was a well-visited site. Sorry, I'm going to cut you off, Dorcas.
If the church was what, Christina?
A well-visited site.
Let's see. Before COVID, we get about 20,000 people a year.
Oh, not bad.
Once COVID comes, everything, it's hard to tell anymore, and before that, and a lot of it is local school groups who come as part of their study of American history, because of what happened here and around here. But they do learn about the basic story of the church in addition to the American Revolution. That's seen as our major historic focus. And I would say local Episcopal ministers who have out-of-town guests at other Episcopal churches, they usually bring their out-of-town guests here too, to say this is what an Episcopal church once looked like. We get a lot of those.
Makes sense. That makes sense. Dorcas, I'm sorry, you had more of a question, I believe.
Yeah, I just love history, and this is so exciting. So the thing I'm so interested in now is how did they get here? I mean, I know about the Christopher Columbus's boats, but how did they travel? I'm sure it was on some kind of cruise ship or something.
Yeah, let's see. It was on those old wooden ships. I think, Dorcas, the people you say probably 2 months for a good voyage in the 17th century to get from England over here to the colonies. That's on a good voyage. It could take longer. Your boat could blow off course. You might not make it. But the average length of a trip on a wooden sailing ship was probably 2 months. So here, you probably mean to stay here because it's pretty hard to get here and then difficult to go back. They are religious. I would say the people who came here, it is freedom of religion. The Church of England was not letting them worship in the way they thought they should worship the gospel. So they did come over here to worship in what they thought was the proper way. They are religious exiles. I would say that's probably true.
So Dorcas, just to give you a perspective, I Googled it real quick. My son had this question, and we were having this conversation in the car, and we actually Googled it 2 weeks ago, which made me think of this, is that the first demonstrated working model of the steamboat was in 1787. So we were trying to say, steamboat, I can't remember if it was a steamboat or not, like the boats that you would take from, England to the US until, it was later 1700s that they were powered by machinery. Before that, it was a slow boat to China, slow.
Yeah, no, it's a sail.
So surely all the people who left did not make it.
Probably not. But
surely,
and I do remember it's interesting because I always forget when we do the tour of faiths every year. It's something that maybe it's just because how I was raised. I kind of forget that many of these faiths back then, like you're saying, they called it a meeting house. And I forget that, yeah, I've seen that before as a meeting house. And I always think that's odd because it's a church, you know, in my mind. And I forget, no, it was a meeting house because they were removing themselves away from everything from the Church of England. And so they were trying to do everything without the sacraments, without all of the stuff that they felt wasn't necessary for a while. And they did that for a while, you know, and then it kind
And
of
that was, they took that very serious. That was
Right.
very important to them. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And
And that's
even
where
the word church, they were comfortable with. Right.
So, man, I'd like to ask just one final question. I'm sorry to be hogging up all the time.
No problem.
But my question, my final question is, how come they just didn't go to another, you know, Europe is big. How come they just didn't go to another country in Europe? And then how did they know that there was land over the ocean? How did they know that before America, but how did they know that it was, that they were going to another, you know, I can't say country, but you know, I hope I'm trying to, how did they know when they got in the boat where they were going? That's the question.
Well, these were like, England had claimed like the northeastern part of what's today the United States based on various voyages of English. So, you know, the Spanish, based on Columbus, claimed South and Central America. The English claimed what is today the northeastern part of our country. So when those people left England for religious reasons, they were coming to a place that was part of England overseas. They weren't going to just some place. These were English colonies. And even though the English crown didn't like these people because of religious reasons, they liked the idea that they were going over there to spread the English flag. And they might trade with England. They might these people are not, they're leaving England proper, but they're going to colonies that are controlled by England. And like, even though it's hard, where are they going? The maps, you know, it's not as random as it seems. By the time these people get here in the mid 1600s, people had made the voyage, you know, since Columbus's time. So they kind of knew where they were going. They might go off course a little because they don't have the best instruments, but they kind of knew, you know, if you sail directly west from England, you're going to get to this other continent. So they kind of did, within like 30, 40 miles, they kind of knew where they were going. And they would have some previous, you know, experience, or somebody had given them, or maybe somebody on the boat even had done this before. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good questions, though. Very good questions. Yeah.
Anybody else have a question? Go ahead, Maureen.
Unmuting.
Okay.
Thank you, Christina. David, that was just fascinating, and especially I enjoyed hearing about the, you know, what you brought up about the tension between preserving the history, elevating the history, but the will and the spirit of the people to really continue to worship in the ways that felt contemporaneous with, you know, the rest of their cultures. I've just found that fascinating, because I think that is something that a lot of churches deal with constantly, you know, the keeping up of all of the traditions and preserving them and getting the value and, you know, deriving the beauty and the wisdom from them. But, you know, then what are we faced with in terms of the people's desires to worship today? And I also found it interesting that the last service was on November 1. I don't know if in the Episcopal faith they observe All Saints Day, but in the Catholic Church we do. So that would have been a pretty auspicious day to have the last service.
I think I think there was a connection. I think they knew what I think they thought they knew what they were doing. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And you know, the minister who performed the last service, it's not that long ago. I met him a couple of times. He comes back once in a while. He was only 30 at the time. So now he's in his mid 60s. He's still an Episcopal priest at a church out in in Long Island. And a lot of what I told you about the last days of the parish, I know because he comes back once in a while and likes to reminisce and tell these stories. Yeah.
Thank you.
He was there last week.
That Maureen, that reminded me of we went to the Baptist church down the road 2 weeks ago for their Sunday service. To my boyfriend's family has some family that attends there, and it was interesting. We were kind of interested to see what the service was going to be like, because I do attend different faith services since I do this, and I kind of enjoy seeing other services. And so they have the band look now. They've upgraded to like where they have the band and they have the music and they have the words up on the wall for everybody to sing along. And then so they did 2 songs like that, and then they did some announcements and a prayer, and then we stood up again, and because we were sitting and then we were up again, and then all of a sudden we sang from a hymnal, and they just pull out the hymnal. It was hymnal like 217 or something, and I thought it was kind of interesting that we were mixing the old and the new, you know, as a way to probably keep both sides of the church that might have been divided on that issue satisfied, you know. And I thought it was neat because I've showed my kids, my kids know how to look and read out of a Torah. They know how to read out of the Quran. They know different, all these different faiths from the work that I do. And so I was showing them, this is the first time actually showing them like the hymnal and how you know what page to go and how you read and you sing, and then you go back to the second verse and you read and sing. And you know, and 2 of my daughters take piano. So I thought it was very interesting for them to be able to follow along the music and see it, like, you know, the music with the words, you know. But I thought it was interesting that here we had some Christian rock kind of stuff going, and then we had hymnals going. You know, that's definitely different. Yeah. All right, any other questions? Because we are just at about an hour. We usually like to keep it to an hour, but I want to make sure it is Teresa, Alexis, or Robert, if you guys have anything you'd like to add. You have to unmute yourself, Robert. I don't know how that's done on an iPad. You know, on a computer and on a phone.
Bob, if you touch the bottom of your screen somehow, it might pop up.
And I could, yeah, David, since you're the host, if you want to stick your mouse over Robert's iPad, you can.
Okay, I think I'm on now.
There we go.
You hear?
Whoa.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was very impressed with the scale of the hundreds of years in which this all developed, and the solidarity of the people to maintain it themselves. Few though there were, and with limited resources, how something within them, it must be, helped them maintain the vision that this place and this belief and this tradition meant so much to them that they would carry on. Very impressive.
Yeah, it reminded me of the Washington Monument. You know, when you see the monument and it has the line across the middle where they built it so tall till they ran out of that.
Yes.
That material, and then that had to go on hold. You know, and so when I saw this church and how they built it to this point, and then it had to go on hold, I can't imagine being in there and worshiping without a roof.
That happened with our church too, St. Matthew's in Washington.
That's gotta be interesting. That just kind of gets left as last.
Yeah, you can't just do it according to your own schedule. You have to have the funding and the angels to help you out, and the people to make it happen.
The people and the material, and I think we're learning that with the fact that things are at shortages.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
You know. So, thank you. Alexis left. He said, "This is wonderful. Thank you." For those of you that are on here that signed up today, well, at 2, we're going to be touring the 6th Church Christ Scientist that's in Washington, D.C. I think we're going to be, I think our hosts are going to be coming in from the reading room that's across the street from it. So if you didn't get a chance to sign up for that, you can go through the website. If you have an issue with the CAPTCHA, let me know and I will just send you the link. But otherwise, and then we have tomorrow at 2 p.m. I think is the Baha'i Faith in Greenville, South Carolina, that is hybrid, that you can attend in person or virtually here and learn about the Baha'i Faith, which is, I believe, still the second largest faith in South Carolina, which is a very unique, different faith. And then we have Monday, the new schedule for the following week will go out, but we have Tuesday, we have Maureen and Bob over here from St. Matthew's in DC that will be giving a presentation as well. So, as well as a few others, but that's all I have in my brain at the moment.
Yeah, Bob will be our tour guide for that, and it's going to be an actual walkthrough of the cathedral.
Yes, so it'll be very, very cool. And so we invite you all to come to any of those. Go ahead and RSVP if you'd like to. They all will be recorded so that they could be on the website and the YouTube channel too later if you do miss one. But we thank you very much, David. Thank you for your time.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Enjoyed it.
Thank you for sharing all your knowledge.
Thanks for having me on. If
I
anybody's ever up here in Mount Vernon, please come visit us.
Yeah, most definitely.
Do I bring myself back? Start video.
All right.
Start video.
All right.
That's great.
Thank you very much. And you could just go ahead at the top left. You can hit stop recording. It should stop. And then and that was for David because he's still just the host.
Okay.